When you get closer to the reality of serial crime and cannibalism, as a combination especially, you just see that it's just each act is infinitely horrible.
Chikatilo told the court how he boiled and ate the parts of his victims. People in the courtroom fainted. Included amid the horrors discovered in Dahmer's apartment, 3 dissolved bodies in acid vats, 4 severed heads.
Turn to God to help me get through each day. I should have stayed with God. I tried and failed and created a Holocaust.
Jeffrey! Jeffrey! I hate you! This is out of control!
In a letter to her parents, Fish wrote how she did bite, kick, and scratch. Fish then choked her to death and cut her into small pieces to cook and eat.
Way it's arguable how evil it is to eat a portion of flesh. Eating the liver of the person is not necessarily more evil than having killed the person to begin with.
This painting was given to me by John Wayne Gacy. I'd interviewed him many times. He was on death row at Menard Penitentiary in southern Illinois. And on one occasion he gave me this painting, knowing that I was coming. He had it prepared for me. And he had indicated that he wanted me to continue in my inquiry on his life, because he said there was a lot to be learned. And I turned the painting around. He told me to turn it over, and I turned it around. There was an inscription on the back which would read, "Dear Bob Ressler, you cannot hope to enjoy the harvest without first laboring in the fields. Best wishes and good luck. Sincerely, John Wayne Gacy, June 1988. And upon turning the painting over and reading that inscription, I said, "Well, thank you very much, John, but what are you referring to? What harvest are we talking about? What labor are we talking about in the fields, and what fields?" And he said, "Well, Mr. Ressler," he said, "you're the criminal profiler, you're the FBI," and he said, "You figure it out." He said, "And if you're able to solve that, that riddle, perhaps you'll come on to what you're looking for. Perhaps you'll reap the harvest." Well, one thing about Gacy is he enjoyed playing the role of a clown. He had clown makeup. He had a clown suit. He had actually entertained people at picnics and children's hospitals and whatever in his clown outfit, sometimes neighborhood gatherings, barbecues, that sort of thing. He enjoyed dressing up in clown suit and clowning. And I think it's somewhat indicative of Gacy's personality. I think there's a symbolic meaning to this clown act. And in fact, one time in conversation with Gacy, I said, "John, why are you so into clowns? What does clowning mean to you?" And he said, "Well," he says, "a clown, when they wear that thin layer of cloth and that grease paint and on their face, and they portray themselves as a fool, and people don't look." He said, "People do not look beyond the grease paint and the clown suit." He says, "They don't see what's below it." He said, and therefore clowns can kind of manipulate people very easily. They can control people without knowing they're being controlled. And he said, really, clowns can get away with murder. And I said, "Figuratively or actually?" And he said, "Well," he says, "you figure it out." In my experience of being in the presence of these violent offenders that have killed so many people, I mean, you have to think, and I do think, always think, where is this coming from? I'm certainly aware of the elements of mental illness. I'm aware of the patterns of psychopaths or sociopaths, as they're sometimes called. I'm aware of the motivation that drives people to do bizarre and violent acts. But at the same time, some of the acts that are done, the acts entailing cannibalism, the acts entailing vampirism, those entailing necrophilia, and mutilation of bodies, things of that nature on a compulsive basis, sometimes it just appears to me that there's got to be another element that science does not readily recognize, and that's the concept of evil. Some of these behavior patterns come straight from hell. There's no rhyme nor reason. There's no rational way of explaining how a person can do the things that, for example, Jeffrey Dahmer did, drilling holes in the heads of his victims in an attempt to bathe their brains in acid and kill their intellect. That is something that it goes far beyond normal motivation to commit homicide. A man named Robert Burdella in Kansas City, Missouri, did much the same, but he anesthetized his victims and drugged them to the point of stupor states, which he kept them in for weeks and sometimes months to keep a captive victim, which he called sex toys. Taking a human being and converting them into a compliant sex toy. One man in Midwest City, Oklahoma, killed his father and cannibalized his father, ate probably at least half, if not more than half, the body before he was detected. And again, this certainly transcends any form of normal homicide. So, do I believe the concept of evil? Yeah, I do. I seriously do. If that shocks anybody, I would ask them, do you believe in God? Do you believe in a supreme being? If you do, then you've got to believe in evil on the other side of the coin.
Over 90% of serial killers are white males, usually from low to middle-class backgrounds. These men are usually intelligent, but as students have difficulty focusing. Most experience a traumatic childhood, often having been abused psychologically, physically, or sexually. Typically, they may be raised in unstable families, often with criminal psychiatric and alcoholic histories. Raised in such families, these children tend to spend much time on their own, and as a result, many practiced animal cruelty at a young age.
Sometimes where, you might not have extreme forms of physical abuse, there is always some kind of extreme emotional or psychological abuse that these young children are subjected to, which really warps them out of shape. I mean, in one way or another, they come to associate the infliction of pain with pleasure.
For example, John Wayne Gacy had an alcoholic father who often beat him. John Sr. would frequently insult the child, practically eliminating his self-confidence, which led to later difficulties John Jr. would have with his masculinity. As an adult, John began to rape and kill, eventually burying 29 bodies in a crawl space under his house. As Gacy was quite popular in his community, his neighbors couldn't believe that John was capable of such atrocities.
Most people who suffer as children grow out of it and become upstanding, decent human beings. But serial killers who've suffered as children repeat the same mistakes over the course of their lives. They can't make the transition into adulthood. They have trouble making the transition in middle age. And at the very time in their lives when they feel they should be reaching the pinnacle of success, they find that they're sliding downhill fast. They want to feel important. They want to feel special. They crave the sense of power and dominance and control, but they simply can't achieve it in any respectable way. And so they kill and they torture and they sodomize and dismember, and that makes them feel good about themselves.
Ted Bundy was born into poverty and never knew his father. He had good grades in school, but an unmanageable temper. At the age of 16, he became a voyeur, obsessed with masturbating. Who would have known that Bundy would become a serial murderer, and yet he killed many women?
Many Americans, when they think of a serial killer, will think of a glassy-eyed lunatic, a monster, someone who acts that way, someone who looks that way. And yet the typical serial killer is extraordinarily ordinary. He's a white, middle-aged man who has an insatiable appetite for power, control, and dominance. And he kills not for money or revenge, but because it makes him feel good, because he enjoys it, because he has fun with it. He likes the thrill, the excitement, the exhilaration that he gets from squeezing the last gasp of breath from his dying victim's body. He enjoys the suffering on the part of the victim, and he tries to make it slow and painful. It makes him feel superior to the extent that he makes his victim inferior.
Gacy maintained a facade of respectability. He maintained a business, a family, married with several children, and that facade was sufficient to cover his tracks for many, many years. He enjoyed dressing up in a clown suit and clowning. He said, "We clowns can get away with murder." Eventually his wife left him, his business started failing, and at that point Gacy was caught, arrested, convicted, and after, again, 3 appeals in his case, Gacy was executed.
With 5% of the world's population, the United States produces more serial killers than the rest of the world, accounting for 76% of the national total. Europe produces the second most serial killers, 17%. England leads European countries, 28%, followed by Germany at 27%. California has the highest number of serial homicide cases in the United States, while New York, Texas, Illinois follow closely behind. Maine has the lowest number of serial homicide cases in the United States, and statistics reveal that 65% of serial killer victims are women. A lady killer with a bloodlust and a temper out of control. In his 42 years, Bundy killed approximately 36 young women. No one really knows exactly how many he killed, although once a police officer asked Bundy in shock how one person could kill 36 women. Bundy shook his head and said, "Add 1 digit to that, and you'll have it."
There are at most about 200 victims of serial killers a year. And that number, although very large, pales by comparison with the almost 18,000 single victim murders in the United States on a yearly basis. The problem in this country is not serial murder, it's domestic violence, it's workplace homicide, it's 2 guys going into a bar, one takes out a gun and shoots the other. Problem, on the other hand, is that serial murderers amass a large body count. We are talking about a very small number of guys who do a lot of damage. You know, they may kill 5 or 10 or even 20 or more. Some of them have killed hundreds. That is enough to terrify most of the people in the country.
A cannibal is a person who eats human flesh. There is much discussion as to whether cannibalism is an inherent characteristic in all human beings, our animal impulses, or whether cannibalism stems only from the minds of mad beasts, such as some of the most prolific serial killers.
Cannibalism is the ultimate form of aggression. There are tribes around the world who have incorporated cannibalism into warfare. So they achieve an ultimate victory not only by killing their enemy, but also by devouring his remains. Serial killers, like Andrei Chikatilo, have also incorporated sadism into their warfare. They have, in the most sadistic possible way, cannibalized their victims by eating their hearts or their eyes or their genitalia in an effort to achieve ultimate pain and suffering on the part of the victim. It's this sadistic impulse that feeds the frail and fragile ego of a serial killer who desires so much, so desperately, to achieve a sense of power over other human beings. And cannibalism is the means whereby that happens.
Anthropological evidence seems to suggest that cannibalism was a kind of activity that our pre-human ancestors indulged in with a certain amount of regularity. So I think that there probably is some innate impulse towards that kind of activity. And one of the things that you see with serial killers, I believe, is that they kind of, again, act out very, very archaic, primitive impulses that clearly still exist on some very, very deep level.
Cannibalism, so you'll hear from these mentally ill, psychotic types that they're consuming their victim to make their victim part of them so that they can keep them and have them always.
Any serial killer who resorts to cannibalism is doing so as a last resort, out of desperation. Certainly, whether it's for sadism or affection, any serial killer who cannibalizes victims has broken one of the most pervasive and profound taboos in all of society. Psychologically, this means that the killer achieves just the opposite of what he had hoped. He may get a temporary rush, he may feel temporarily high, but in terms of his ego, in terms of self-image, he has got to feel worse about himself than he has before. On the other hand, once he has cannibalized, anything goes.
As cannibalism may have stemmed from the days of our primitive ancestors, modern-day crime reveals a few of time's most prolific serial killers as cannibals. In 1968, the silver screen immortalized flesh-eating zombies roaming the hills of Pennsylvania in search of a good snack in George A. Romero's Dead trilogy. These films seemed a mere footnote to the madness and turbulence that had played out in real life during a most murderous decade, the 60s.
Now is the time.
Out of Vietnam.
6 years later, chainsaws and cannibal family values were brought to the screen in Tobe Hooper's surreal cult thriller, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
There's a sense in which these are our versions of what scholars call wonder tales. These are stories that fill us with a sense of the marvelous and the, sort of deliciously terrifying. People love to hear stories like that. And, these kinds of Hollywood horror movies are our versions of those kind of age-old tales of wonder and terror and adventure and so on and so forth. And, the confrontation with these mythic monsters that have always populated these kinds of stories.
It is so extraordinary, so terrifying, so hideous, that it might as well be fiction. Most people don't see much of a difference between Hannibal Lecter, who was actually a figment of Thomas Harris's imagination in the film Silence of the Lambs, and Jeffrey Dahmer, who was a real-life, flesh-and-blood serial murderer. To the average person, there is no difference between fact and fantasy. The more extraordinary, the more hideous, the more we fictionalize these people so that they can become entertaining, so that they're fun. After all, muggings are not at all entertainment for most people because they happen too often to anybody. But serial murder That seems out of the question for most people.
Hannibal the Cannibal Lecter has captured the imagination of the nation. The Silence of the Lambs, a novel by Thomas Harris, was adapted for the screen in 1991, in which Lecter played Doctor to millions of riveted moviegoers, perhaps cinema's guiltiest pleasure since Norman Bates.
The figure of Hannibal Lecter, as he's portrayed on the screen, is not really an accurate portrayal of a serial killer. First of all, I know of no serial killer that was ever a psychiatrist. I know of some medical doctors who have taken a number of lives, but not in the perverse fashion of Hannibal Lecter. I know of no person of his caliber high up in society that was a cannibal, or who that was so well integrated into the upper levels of society, and yet at the same time such a diabolically deranged individual. And of course, what Harris did here is just combine the organized and the disorganized personalities into one mixed bag, which really doesn't exist in real life.
We kind of want to believe, and I think this is the meaning of Hannibal, is that the serial killer is a kind of to some degree, a bit of a Nietzschean Superman, that he's more clever, more intelligent, more cagey than nearly anyone, except the one person who in the end, of course, will capture him. And even in the case of Hannibal, there's a certain elegance imparted to him, although in some ways it only makes him more terrifying. But it is part of the myth of the serial killer, at least as it's now being elaborated, that the serial killer is bigger than life.
There's something weirdly asexual about Hannibal Lecter. You know, his motivations don't seem to be sexual at all. His desire to kill and devour other people. That's a very, very interesting aspect of his character. He almost seems to be above that. I mean, it's another thing that makes him seem not quite human and really larger than life in some way. He doesn't seem to be at the mercy of these perverse sexual needs, whereas somebody like Fish or Dahmer or any of these people, you know, they really, really are.
Long before Hannibal Lecter, fictional cannibal, there was a man the tabloids labeled both the Gray Man and the Werewolf of Wisteria. He was a true-life cannibal, a living monster.